That's all. Service as we were today, and appreciate those who follow the Lord in baptism. What a great blessing that is. I was thinking as we were singing here together, I haven't had a rest home service since about March. You realize that? You sort of get into the issue of that, and or the pattern, I guess is the word of that. And I was sitting here today thinking about that, and I thought, we used to go, I guess, once a month, something like that. And we would go to the different homes here in the area and have a rest home service. And sometimes there was 2 or 3. Sometimes there were 4 or 5. Sometimes 6 or 7. Sometimes 10 or 11. Never more than 15, I don't think. I'm not sure I ever had one more than 15, but it just seems like with the situation the way it is, we're losing a lot of those opportunities, aren't we? And just myself, just thinking about some of the changes that are coming about to our society, to our church, just lots of areas that I just wonder. Don't need to be pessimistic tonight, but you just wonder if it'll ever come back. I have read some statistics about folks attending church, and there are statistics out there. And every time you quote statistics, you always sort of wonder about some things. But they say that they haven't been to church since March, and they don't plan to go to church. And these were individuals who were fairly faithful, I guess. More mainline churches, I guess, is where this is from. But, it's a time we have to think about what's going on in our country, and we need to, be very much in prayer for our situation. And it would be nothing that I think Satan would rather do than see us become non-effective, or at least become ineffective in this world today. And, it's difficult for a lot of people who are having some difficulties with health problems. I mentioned Jim this morning, and you probably heard me say this, but Pat was here yesterday. She was looking for a walker. I guess she found one. Maybe she should have said, she didn't say anything about saying it in church. She wanted one with all wheels on. I knew Mom had one. It wasn't quite the kind that she wanted, and so she went over there and checked for Velma, because I said, Velma had not cut her arm, but skinned her arm here, and they weren't able to pull the skin back, is what she told me. And so they were looking for one for her. But she said that, Jim was ready to come home on Saturday, and now because of this outbreak, it's going to be 9 more days. And I understand that what happens is that she goes and she sits outside the window and visits a little bit. It's just a difficult time, isn't it? And a lot more sometimes than we think about. And we have a tendency to forget about folks who are having some very difficult situations with all of these things that are going on. So we need to be praying for our folks, other folks as well, but especially our folks here at our church, and trying to, do all we can to comfort them and encourage them in these days that are ahead. Abraham and Lot, this is always the section that you think about whenever you think about Abraham, I think, and it's one of those areas that is sad. It leads to some other issues. There's no doubt about that. And as we look at this section of Scripture, I was studying this, and I forget who said this, but it said that Abraham failed his first 2 tests. And boy, we've looked at that, haven't we? He failed the test of going into Egypt whenever God gave him that test. He failed the test of saying that his wife, Sarah, was his sister when really she was his wife. 2 miserable failures, basically, that goes on in the life of Abraham, not being able to trust God for his safety and situation that's in. But he passes the 3rd test with great success. Now, there's something to be said about that for us tonight. And I'm not asking you to raise your hand, but I wonder, have you ever failed one of God's tests? I'm sure we all say yes. There's been those times. Whenever the test came into my life and I really wasn't what I should be for the Lord, and I failed it, and I am glad tonight that God gives another one. And then He gives the 3rd one. and he gives them more tests because he's a gracious God and he cares for us. And so that's what we're seeing tonight in this section is that even though Abraham has failed the test, when you fail the test, you must learn some lessons. That's the real issue. I want to learn something whenever God is dealing in my life. And even if I don't always do the way that I should do things, I need to be able to learn some areas that are going to be beneficial and helpful in the future. Of course, the issue here between Lot and Abraham is wealth. Boy, how much blood has been spilt over wealth and land? How many harsh words and family issues have developed over these areas? So this is not something that is foreign to any culture, and it's not something unique to American culture, folks. This is something that is fairly worldwide in its application. And that's really what's going on here tonight, is there's going to be some family problems over this issue. And family trouble is the worst kind of trouble, isn't it? I'm sure all of us maybe have experienced it in some way. But there's no trouble that's any worse than family trouble. Whenever the families are having some difficulties and there's some issues that are going on that have to be dealt with, nothing ever really rises to the level of intensity because of the closeness of the situation and also because of probably the sameness of the ideas, especially when it comes to brothers and sisters and cousins and all the gene pools that would be close to one another when you think about those issues. So nothing really gets any worse. Oh, yeah, maybe I'm overstating the case, but those can be very, very difficult. And when Abraham returns to the land from Egypt, where God finally secures him out of that place, he's going to return to some family problems. And God teaches us new lessons every step of life's pathway. Never think you're to the point where you've got it all figured out. Wouldn't it be nice? Now, if you do have it all figured out, you're in heaven, okay? And I don't think any of us are there yet. You might be ready to go, but it's not God's time for you. And so you don't have it figured out yet. And every step we take, every movement that we make in this world, there's going to be some tests. There's going to be some lessons. God is not satisfied with us the way we are. You know, sometimes we might become satisfied, but God's not satisfied. God is always prodding you. He's like that teacher in school that really got the best out of you. You remember that teacher? They didn't let you just sort of sit there and vegetate. But they pushed you. And they pushed you hard. And when you thought you couldn't take any more, they still pushed. Because what we think we can do and what we can do are two different animals. Because sometimes we have a tendency to become very self-sufficient. And as God is pushing us, and I'm talking spiritually now, not so much physically. We need to be pushed physically too, no doubt about that. But as God pushes us spiritually, there are more and more lessons that he wants to teach us. And Abraham is a classic example of that, as we find this situation coming into his life. He's just been to Egypt. He's just lied about the situation. Comes back home, more problems. You know, that seems to be pretty typical, doesn't it, of most people's lives, is the fact that there's going to be some problems to face. And, you know, I've said it before, you're either coming out of a problem or you're going into a problem, probably, of some type. And God designs it that way so we can grow and be more like himself. And the more we see of Abraham's life, the fuller the revelation of God is. He is directing him. He is leading him on a path that he needs to understand and learn some lessons. And God is leading us on our path. Every person who's a believer in this room tonight, you have a path that God is leading you on. Hebrews chapter 12 will talk about the course that you are running. He has that course all laid out for you individually. Whenever Washington, D.C. or Columbus, Ohio turns down edicts, they do it on a blanket place. You know, it's like everybody must do the same thing. That's usually not very effective. God doesn't do that for us. He doesn't give blanket statements for us, but He takes our lives and He develops a plan according to what our lives are. So they are tailor-made for you and for me. That's how much He loves us. That's how much He cares about us this evening. That's how much He's concerned about us, is that He would tailor-make a plan for you to be in the very center of His will, and He wants the very best for you. And in Abraham's life, another problem arises. 5 things tonight I want you to think about. No subpoints, just 5 observations that I want to make from this passage. First thing we find in verses 5 and 6 is serious problem. It's going to be a serious problem that occurs. Verses 5 and 6, we develop this serious problem that happens in the life of Abraham. And Lot also. Now, we could talk about the fact He brings Lot to start with. God never really tells him to bring Lot, but He does anyway. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. Riches. Abraham and Lot have done well. Well, they've worked hard. They had stuff on the way. We saw that as they departed from Ur and came to the country. And they were individuals that worked hard for what they had received. And so they were both enriching themselves because of this hard work. And you know, God always rewards, and we are to be workers. We are to work hard at what God has given us to do. There's no excuse for us to be lazy in any of the applications of our lives. And so we find here they had worked hard, and they had done well in Egypt. You know, remember we said that Pharaoh had given them much, and so not only had Abraham done well, but it appears that Lot has done well also. This is, from what I understand, the first instance of riches in the Bible. Think about that. Genesis is the book of first. This is the first instance of riches in the Bible. And so here we have a problem with wealth and believers. Now let's put our disclaimers out there, right? You must always do this anytime that you speak about this area. The Bible never condemns wealth. You know, it's not that we are to be destitute. Yes, you say Jesus Christ had no place to lay His head, right? But you're not Jesus Christ tonight. And He had no place to lay His head. But the Bible never condemns wealth. It's not a sin. As long as, you knew that was coming, didn't you? As long as it was honorably obtained. Now that's a loaded sentence. It must be honorably attained, which means it must be done on the up and up. It must be done in a way that is ethical and done in a way which is in accordance with all the laws that are going on. And there's nothing wrong with it as long as the person who has it understands that it belongs to God. That's another big issue. That's far larger than our wealth. Everything we have belongs to God. You know? And if we don't see that early in life, we've got some problems. Whether it's children, grandchildren, whether it's houses, or whether it's automobiles, whether it's whatever it is, gifts, talents, abilities. If we don't realize that they're God's and God has given them to us, we've got some problems. And so as long as one understands that it belongs to God, and God gave it to us, there's nothing wrong with that. And also that it's being used as it's in God's sight. Okay? God is directing the resources or the riches that are there. And so, you know, there's nothing wrong with us obtaining what this world has as long as we do it the right way. And there's going to be some other things as we go through, we'll see, that have to also be in place. But God is not down on us getting ahead in this world. But, and I think you need to understand this, and all of us do, I'm sure, wealth increases the responsibility. The more we have, the more we are responsible. Well, that's just a principle of God's Word. If God has given you much, then God is asking much from you. Now, this is not just your wealth. This would be everything about you is involved in this area. And we find that it can be sin if it's not used properly. And if it's obtained illegally, in some sort of a despicable or underhanded method. But it also develops another problem, and we see the problem here, and that's the problem of relatives. I've heard cases of individuals who have instantly, I won't even say how they've got it because I don't even want to use that word lottery here in church, but instantly have received money, and all of a sudden they have developed all kinds of new relatives. Isn't it amazing how that happens? Every time I think about this, I think of the prodigal son, don't you? He's in that far country. As long as he has money, what's he got? Friends. As long as he's got resources, they're flocking to him. But as soon as they dry up, when he needs his friends, they're not there. Are those friends? Of course not. Those are leeches. And so, it does many times cause problems. And, I think, though, we probably ought to state it this way. It probably doesn't so much cause the problem as it does reveal the problem, because the problem is there already. These kind of circumstances have a tendency to cause the problems to come to the surface. And so we find that there's going to be problems here between Uncle Abraham and nephew Lot because of these things. How often do we not see in our day and age the deplorable fact that continues to be experienced since the days of Abraham? How many families do you know that are torn apart over a $10 bill? How many families do you know that are at each other's throat because something happened sometime in their life? The list is long, isn't it? And all these things are temporal things that are ours. But the problem here is pasture and water. And you say, well, that shouldn't be. It is a great problem in Palestine. It's a very desert country. Water is something that is a great commodity to have. You read Genesis, and I'm reading about Joseph now, or just starting reading about Jacob, and he's digging these wells, and they're coming and stealing them from him, the people are, because there's not the water they want, and these oases. This is not 20th century, 21st century America. This is Palestine. So there's a great problem with water, and there are others in this land here called the Canaanites that are watching all of this develop as well. But he says here that the land's not able to bear them, and so there's a problem coming up, and the problem is we just don't have enough resources for what we have. What are we going to do? How are we going to handle it? After we have the problem, we have the strife that begins in verse 7. It's deplorable by any stretch of the imagination, and there was a strife. And the word strife here means it got bitter. But notice it's between the herdsman of Abraham's cattle and the herdsman of Lot's camel. It would seem as if Abraham and Lot at this point are not involved in the actual fracas or ruckus, there's the word, ruckus that's going on. It seems to be more their handlers of their resources that are doing this. And Moses points out to us, because he's the author of Genesis, he says, the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelt then in the land. The problem begins with servants. They're having trouble. And it was limited to them, it would appear to be, for a while. They both wanted the best for their flock. You say, well, that's just common sense. They want what's best. Here are two of God's people, Abraham and Lot. God has called them from Ur of the Chaldees. And here are these two pagan groups, Canaanites, and folks, they were pagan, and Perizzites, they were pagan. Moses points out that they were also dwelling in the land. There's a purpose for that being stated here by the Spirit of God. The heathen around are watching this quarrel that's going on between God's children. The heathen around are involved in seeing how they are handling their problems. This really is the saddest part of the whole passage. It's probably even sadder than Lot choosing to go to Sodom. Because here are unsaved people are watching these believers, let's put it in our vernacular today, our terminology today, watching these believers, and as they're watching them, they're seeing them quarrel about issues that really are not eternal issues, but they're very temporal issues. Terrible. The testimony is not what it should be. So after the serious problem and the deplorable strife, we have a generous proposal, verses 8 and 9, and truly it is a generous proposal. Abraham determined to be a peacemaker, not a troublemaker. Isn't that a great statement? All of us have to determine whether we're going to be peacemakers or troublemakers. It comes to us at some time in our life. And Abraham has made a declaration, and here the issue is the one who should have gotten preferential treatment because of culture and because of age is the one who becomes the peacemaker. Verse 8, and Abram said unto Lot, notice he is the older, and so he would be the leader. Let there be no strife, and there's our word again, I pray thee between me and thee. He knew it was going to develop to a point where they would also be involved in this problem. And between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou take the left, then I will go to the right, or if thou depart to the right, then I will go to the left. Abraham takes the initiative and begs that there be no strife. Abraham takes the initiative. Sometimes someone has to take the initiative when it comes to strife. Just letting things move the way they were moving in verses 6 and 7, verses 5, 6, and 7, would have resulted in greater problems. But the initiative had to be seized, and Abraham seizes that initiative. Because this could have gotten to be even a larger problem. You know the way most problems are? If problems are not dealt with early, they have a tendency to escalate and get larger and larger and larger. Here, all we are doing is quarreling. We know that Abraham has 314 armed men in his camp who could go and defeat the army who has captured Lot later on in the book. And so Abraham was not a man of small means. And I would have thought that Abraham, with his military prowess at that point, could have pressed his argument very, very forcibly at this point. But he says, no. We're not going to allow it to escalate into that kind of a situation. Wise man. Understanding what's really important. Abraham wants none of this. And he states the fact that they are, verse 8, they are brethren. Brethren. There should be a common thread that runs through God's people. Now, there should be that in families. That should just be a biological connection that one has. But we have as the family of God, we have a greater connection. We have the Holy Spirit who connects us to one another and connects us to Jesus Christ himself. So therefore, we should also see that we are brethren when it comes to these problems that come. And Abraham truly is the one who takes the initiative to state this. Boy, notice how large-hearted this is. He's older. He's the chief of the family. Who did God promise the land to? Lot? No. God promised the land to Abraham. It was Abraham's claim. Everything should have gone his way. Lot should have taken secondary issues. But he allows his nephew the first choice. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 24 says that God's person should not strive. The servant of God must not strive. I think Abraham's learned some lessons, don't you? He learned some lessons down there in Egypt. He messed up. He took care of himself first back then, remember? He said, if they see you, Sarah, they're going to want you for their wife, and You're a very fair woman to look upon. Let's fudge the truth here. It's a half-truth. Sometimes those are kind of the worst types, aren't they? Let's just say that you are my sister. At that point of the test, Abraham was looking out for number one, taking care of himself. But we cannot say that at this point. He has learned some lessons. He is no longer looking out for number one. Because if he was looking out for number one, he would say, Lot, get yourself over there in that little piece of land I designate to you and keep your mouth shut. And he would have had every right to do so because he was the patriarch of the family and he was the one that God gave the promise to. But he was not going to assert his rights. He was going to be large-hearted. He has learned some lessons in Egypt. If we don't learn some lessons in our life, it's sad. And sometimes we don't. We seem to just go on the same way as always. Every circumstance that God brings into your life should be a teaching experience of how He's working in your heart. We find that He is not going to demand His rights at this point. Well, let's hope Lot steps up to the plate, right? Let's hope Lot does the right thing. Now remember, Lot's been in Egypt. Verse 10, we have the fourth area. After the generous proposal, we have a very selfish choice. Look at verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plains of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt that comes down from Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Lot. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before God. And notice the adverb, exceedingly. Not just sinners, but exceedingly great. And folks, that becomes a key thought as you go through this part of Genesis, is the exceedingly wickedness of the city of Sodom. We find that he makes a very selfish choice. The word here that we have to use is the word covetousness. Number 10 commandment really is the core commandment as far as how the commandments work in our lives. They all sort of filter down to number 10. Thou shalt not covet. Because when one covets, the other commandments then become a part of the play. You know, when it comes to stealing, probably, and I think almost always we would say this, that covetousness is part of the process of stealing. And you can go through and look at the other commandments and make sort of the same general comment. And so, you know, covetousness is really the sin here. A great appetite for more. And what I have found in my life, and as I've studied this topic in the Bible, it has absolutely nothing to do with how much a person has. It has absolutely everything to do with how much a person wants. That's covetousness. A person can be rich and have everything and still covet, or a person can be poor and have almost nothing and covet. It has nothing to do with his financial situation. It has everything to do with his heart attitude. It's what he wants, what she wants is involved. And it leads to many other sins. Probably almost every, well, maybe I don't make a blanket statement, but most other sins are probably somehow linked to the sin of covetousness in one's life. Lot looks out on this well-watered plain, and we find that what the eye sees, the heart loves, right? Isn't that true for covetousness? What the eye sees, and I read that in Warren Wiersbe, a great statement. What the eye sees, the heart loves. What it views. He looks on this well-watered plain, and everything looks so good, and he would be a fool not to choose that section of land. The sole reason is his own possessions and his advantages. What is in this for me? Popular terminology for our day and age today. What do I get out of this? How can I use this to my advantage? What is this worth to you? How much are you going to pay me for what I do? All that kind of terminology is a root of covetousness in one's life. You know, there's folks who won't do a thing unless you pay them for it. That's sort of the way Lot views things. He says, I got to choose what's best. I got to take care of, number one, the land was fertile, and he moved his tent as far as Sodom. But these natural blessings are going to be accompanied by some moral blight. Verse 13 would talk about that moral blight. The men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked. And so the moral blight is there also. And there's many modern illustrations of God's people choosing things that really are not of the most utmost importance. You know, whenever we look for an area and someplace to locate ourselves, scenery should not be the number one advantage or the number one reason for our decision making, or even a job, material benefits. Really, the number one decision should be a church. And let me tell you, from what I'm understanding, that is becoming more and more of a difficult situation to find. Because it's the spiritual part of mankind that is of the most importance. The souls of children starving amid worldliness. Same should be said for the sports program of the school, sacrificing everything so that temporary issues can somehow be fulfilled is truly not a part of God's plan. Making choices that are dominated solely by the view of the eye and what the heart wants the eye sees. Making those decisions that show that the decision is being made by what I'm going to get or what advantage I have, or having my children in the best program or something of this nature, that's a mistake. The spiritual concern should always be the number one concern. Many parents, I think, would say that they have made some mistakes when it comes to the choices that they have made for their offspring, simply because of the siren call of the coach or the affluence or something of that nature. Lot makes his call made on affluence and what's easy for him and how he can get ahead. This is a mistake in which he will suffer the rest of his life. Sounds ominous, doesn't it? There are decisions that we make that will affect every part of our lives from now on. And all of us come to those kind of decisions. At your age, you've probably been through some of them, but you may be through some more in the future. But they will affect everything we do. That's why we need to pray for wisdom, James chapter 1 tells us. The wisdom that only God gives, because a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. But if you and I lack wisdom, let's ask from the Father above, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not. Lot is moving down the wrong road. We call it the slippery slide argument, don't we? But that's where he's going. Verse 10, we find that he looked at Sodom, right? You've seen this before. He lifted up his eyes and beheld the plain of Sodom. Verses 11 and 12, we find that he then moved to Sodom. He dwelt in the land. Verse 12, he pitched his tent towards Sodom. Chapter 14, verse 12, and they took Lot, Abraham's brother, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. It always follows that logical sequence of events. It starts with the eyes, and then it moves on to something else, and finally the person is feeling very much at home in the situation that they have placed themselves in. Selfish choice. It's about me. It's about what I want. It's about what I can gain. It's about who I can influence. After the serious problem and deplorable strife, the generous proposal, the selfish choice, we have the divine revelation. Starts in verse 14. After Lot has already left, Abraham all alone. I wonder if Abraham thought to himself, did I make the right choice? Should I have exerted my rights and my privileges and told Lot to go and do what he needs to do, and I'm going to take what I want? He probably pondered whether he had made the right choice or not. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. It's an argument from silence, which are the weakest argument that we could find in Scripture. But he's wondering maybe. And you know, I would say this is true also. After any great moral decision is made, there's always time to rethink it. Have you noticed that in your life? When you have made some kind of a moral decision, maybe a stand you've had to take, maybe it's about worship in your home, maybe it's about some decision that your home is going to make. After you make it, there's usually a time whenever there is a time to think it over again. And we need the assurance of God that we have made the right decision. Abraham's probably going, have I made the right decision? During this time alone, what happens? God says, Abraham, you have done exactly what you should do, right? The Lord said unto Abraham, what a comfort it is now to have God communicate to the soul of Abraham and say, Abraham, you have done what is right. What greater blessing in our lives can we have than to have the affirmation of God's blessings upon us when we are making decisions that are based on moral situations and circumstances? Having the blessings of God in your life is what all of us should be about. And that's what Abraham's about here. Notice this threefold revelation that he gets. In verse 14, he talks about the prospect of this. He says, Abraham, or God says to Abraham, after Lot's gone now, okay, he's there where he can be used of him, lift up thine eyes and look from the place where thou art northward, southward, eastward, and westward. He lifted up his eyes. God told him to look around him, gain some perspective. What's going on? Secondly, he gave him a promise, verses 15 and 16. For the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed, notice the singular, as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. You're going to be blessed. No, I don't even have a son. This is going to come into the view. I'm getting up in years, and I don't even have anybody who's my offspring. But yet God gives him this promise. This land will be for you and your offsprings. Of course, the possessions are going to be enjoyed also. Verse 17, rise, walk through the land in the length of it and the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Walk through this land, Abraham. It's going to be yours. Verse 18, he removed his tent and came and dwelled in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron. And notice what he does next. You can follow his life by the altars in his life, and built there an altar unto the Lord. Abraham's life is dominated by the altars. When he did not build the altar in Egypt, tragedy. But the altar is looked upon as a time of fellowship between him and God. He moves his tents to Hebron. Fellowship is the idea there. Wholehearted obedience. He builds his altar. And we find that he is now where God would have him to be. Abraham took Lot out of Egypt, but he could never take Egypt out of Lot. Boy, that's a true sentence. Abraham took Lot out of Egypt, but he could never take Egypt out of Lot. You see it here. Lot says, I will take. Abraham says, I will give. Lot loses everything because his mindset is, I will take. He loses his wife, right? She's so enamored with Sodom that she has to look back and she becomes a pillar of salt. He loses his son-in-laws. He loses his city. He loses his 2 daughters. I mean, there are some vile things that are going to happen between Lot and his 2 daughters. Lot says, I will take, and he lost everything. Abraham says, I will give, and what does he get? His seed is as the sand of the seashore. God's blessings. What are you saying tonight? I will take, or I will give. It really is the heart attitude that makes the difference. Because so many folks want to take so they can have more and more. Or do we give? 3 things in closing that I want to get to you very briefly. Differences in believers. There's a great contrast. It's not on the screen for you, but 3 things. Differences in believers. Notice the preposition here. In, between, and for. Differences in believers, first of all. There's a great contrast between Lot and Abraham, right? Let's think about Lot, first of all. If it wasn't for 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, I would have a hard time knowing this man was a believer, wouldn't you? But then I have this statement in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, that his righteous soul was offended by the wickedness that was going on around him. But though righteous by 2 Peter's standards, and I would say those are the correct standards, I'm not questioning that at all, he is still living by sight, thinking only of his own advantages and his own pleasures. He is a believer who is living by his own sight. What is in this for me? What can I make? How can I get something from this? Worldliness is his dominant characteristic. It's what the world wants. He only thinks about the well-watered plains. This believer is not fully consecrated. He wants the best of both worlds. He wants the best of the world, and he wants the best of God. He wants just enough of God to sleep good at night. You know, $2 worth of God. I don't want enough to change my life. I just want enough to make me sleep at night. How many believers do you know are that way? You know, don't do anything to rock my boat. Just make me peaceful. Well, that's what Lot is. One part of life must suffer because you can't have both the world and God. And the part that suffered was truly the part with God. Abraham, differences in believers, he was large-hearted in his spirit. He simply accepted God's promises, wholehearted obedience to God's will, courageous testimony in the altar of worship. He is a consecrated believer who puts God first, to whom God's presence is everything. Well, there's differences today in believers. They're just as striking and just as puzzling. How in the world can 2 know Christ and then have such different attitudes and activities about certain issues? Differences in believers. Secondly, differences between believers. You know, there's going to be differences between believers. God's children will have their differences, and it could lead to trouble. How do we handle this? We submit to the leadership over us, of course, and we deal with the problems when they come. We don't fester them, we don't warm them over, and we don't allow them to become part of our thinking, especially in the emotional state. We have to look at what God's Word tells us about these issues. Those that put God first will never be bereaved of their just rights because God will see to that. Differences in believers, differences between believers, and differences for believers. Thirdly, Lot got what he wanted. Sodom. He becomes a leader in the city. He's at the gates. But spiritually, I can find no place that he's happy after this choice. It's over for him. There's no witness for God in his life. They laugh at him. I mean, you know, when he tries to warn them about the situation with the 2 angels that come, they laugh at the man. Who made you judge over us? Why all of a sudden are you now having this pious streak in your life? There's no real blessing in his home. He lost his wife, and what his daughters do to him are appalling. Even in our culture today, maybe I can't probably say that much longer, but they're still appalling even in our culture today what happens there with the incest that's going on. He ends in spiritual and social disaster. I don't think anybody would argue with that. Why? Because his idea is, what can I get? But not Abraham. His experience is different. God becomes increasingly more real to him. There was glory and power in his life from this point on. He never regretted his actions of putting God first. I don't find any place where Abraham is saying, boy, I blew it. Isn't that a great way to live your life? Never saying you blew it. He didn't say that. He never regrets putting God's first in his life. We always experience his divine blessing in the proportion of our faithfulness. I'm going to say that one more time and finish. We always experience his divine blessings and his favor in absolute proportion to our faithfulness to him. If you want God's favor in your life tonight, and you want God's blessings in your life, one key is faithfulness to him. What a stark contrast. God's Word teaches us so much by contrast. And there's no place you see contrast any greater than between Lot and Abraham. Lot, what can I get? Abraham, what can I give? What's the question of your life tonight? Father, I thank you for